Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this topic for lots of reasons, but especially today because it is October, which is Sensory Awareness Month. So we're sort of right on track with that. Before I officially sort of dive in, I would like to ask you a little bit about why you're here today, and if you can put just a few words about what interests you about this topic in the chat. That would be helpful for me. So I'll just wait a minute while people put a few things in the chat about why you're interested in this topic. It's not something that we're often trained on to learn about sensory processing. And so I'm always curious about if people have had training on sensory processing before, or if this is new information, and what in particular you're interested in. So I see maybe some people who know someone who is possibly with sensory processing differences, want to support their clients, interested in prepping for the licensing exam. You never know, it could show up there, working in schools. So I see a sort of a variety. So this is helpful for me. What I'm going to start with is just some general information about what sensory processing is, and a little bit we'll talk about the neuroscience aspects of what sensory processing looks like on the neuroscience level, and then we'll get into sort of the social work related aspects and thinking about assessment and thinking about how we can be really supportive of people with sensory processing differences. I'm going to try to continue to talk about people with sensory processing differences, but my research and my practice have largely been focused on children, so you may hear me slip back into some of that language. So what is sensory processing? Sensory processing really refers to the way that the nervous system receives sensory messages and responds. And this happens in a few different ways. So the first is through detection. Detection is really becoming aware of sensory stimuli and changes in sensation. So the example I often use is if you're sitting in your office or sitting at home and you hear a lawnmower go by. So your brain becomes aware of that sensory stimuli, hearing that sound. And eventually, usually because it's not really relevant to what you're doing and because it's a familiar sensory stimuli, your brain will eventually tune it out, which relates to the next aspect of sensory processing, which is modulation. So this is the brain's ability to respond appropriately to the sensory environment and remain at an appropriate level of arousal or alertness. So meaning being able to tune out certain aspects of sensory processing that aren't relevant to what you're trying to focus on, but also paying attention to sensory stimuli that's new or different or requires attention. And then interpretation. So this is the way that the brain organizes and responds to sensory stimuli. So this is really about the way that sensation creates perception and the way that we understand the world. And so I have this image here of an optical illusion. If we took the hand out and we took the pencil out and we sort of hid that corner of the desk, your brain would think, oh, there's really a hole there. But because we have some other context clues, we understand that it's a drawing. But again, that's a good example for me of thinking about how sensation creates our perception. So I'm sure you're familiar with the sensory systems or the senses on the left. I'm going to talk about 3 additional systems or senses that you may not be as familiar with. So the vestibular system or the vestibular sense is awareness of body balance and movement. And this refers to the rotation of our bodies and the gravitational pull upon our bodies. So being rooted down to the earth, feeling grounded in the earth. Just like balance, this stems from the inner ear. So what I always think of thinking about the vestibular system is if you've had the experience of having a baby fall asleep on you at any point, they fall asleep on you and then maybe your arm falls asleep or you have to do something revolutionary, like you want to go eat something. and then you have to put the baby down. Well, there's that moment of, oh, I don't want to have to put this baby down, because inevitably what happens, very often babies wake up. And what I've learned is that this is related to that vestibular sense, that even when babies are asleep, they can sense the rotation of their body, the movement of their body, and that gravitational pull as you sort of lower them down into the crib. And so that's why babies, it feels like you're trying to put a bomb down when you're trying to get them to stay asleep when you move them. The proprioceptive sense tells us about our body position. So this is recognized by our joints and by our muscles, things like stretching, pushing, pulling. This is an organizing sense. And so when I've had kids that I've worked with, I've had a few kids that I've noticed if I sort of squeezed their shoulder while I was talking to them, they were able to focus and attend to what I was saying a little bit better. We're not really allowed to have gum in school, but for kids who need a little bit of sensory input or need that organizational input, chewing on gummy bears or gum or things like that can also be organizing for that reason. And then the interoceptive sense helps us to understand and recognize things that are going on in our body. So things like hunger and fatigue. So I'm going to share a little bit about Ayres and introduce her to you. She's really the pioneer of this work. So she started studying what she referred to as sensory integration. You'll see in the literature sensory integration, sensory processing, and they're typically used interchangeably, but sensory processing is sort of the more common, more current language. So she was an occupational therapist and an educational psychologist, and she developed Ayres sensory integration theory. The sensory integration theory has sort of three elements to it, or three aspects of it. One, it argues that sensation affects learning and behavior. And particularly as we go through the presentation, we'll see how that's the case. But you can imagine that, of course, our senses are going to have an impact on how we learn and how we respond to our environment, particularly if there are differences in how we perceive and process sensory messages and sensory input. So sensory integration theory helps us to identify patterns of function and dysfunction, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those patterns look like in a few minutes. And one of the aspects of sensory integration theory that it focuses on is intervention that focuses on motor learning, adaptive responses, and purposeful activity. And oftentimes, especially when working with children, that purposeful activity and the interventions are focused on play. And so it's really a very natural approach for working on sensory processing for children. And she also developed the sensory integration praxis test, which helps to assess sensory processing. It's focused on children, but this is developed to help us be able to assess sensory processing. And the SIPT is still very much used today. So sensory processing disorder is something that you will hear about in the literature. I refer to sensory processing differences, or SPD, as sensory processing differences rather than sensory processing disorder. And this is because SPD was debated for inclusion in DSM-5, but it was not included because the feeling was that there needed to be more research to establish it as its own distinct condition. So I think of it as sensory processing differences, but it's defined as a neurobiological condition that affects the way that a person receives, processes, and understands sensory messages. And we may see hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. Hypersensitivity is feeling overwhelmed by your senses. It's as though you're being bombarded with sensory information. And so people who experience hypersensitivity may experience loud noise or be really distracted by noises when other people aren't bothered. They may be picky about clothing or eating. Oftentimes, children who are picky about clothing, who are hypersensitive, they're notorious for not liking the tags on their clothing or the seams, that those can be very irritating to them. There are a number of sensory-friendly clothing brands that don't have tags, and the seams are a little bit smoother. They may be easily distracted or overwhelmed. And this is sort of natural. You can imagine that if you feel like you're being bombarded by sensory information, that you would feel pretty distracted and overwhelmed throughout your day. They may be difficult to soothe, and they may have poor balance. On the other end of the spectrum is hyposensitivity. And so hyposensitivity is needing more sensory input in order to be able to attend to what's going on around you, to participate in things that are activities that are happening, and to be able to focus and stay regulated. So these people may have a strong desire to touch people or objects even when not appropriate. They may have a high tolerance for pain. One of the participants in a study that I did, I talked with caregivers of children with sensory processing differences. And one of the caregivers talked about how his son broke his leg and they didn't know it right away. They knew that he was upset, they knew that he was hurt, but not that intensity of hurt. And so he had that high tolerance for pain. Related to that, they may not understand their own strength. They're fidgety, they like to move around a lot, and they have difficulty staying focused. So sensory processing disorder really is, or sensory processing differences can be really complicated to understand, and it can make diagnosis challenging for us when we're looking at behaviors and emotional reactions. And this is because people with SPD may experience it in many different ways. They may be hypersensitive to some forms of stimuli, while they're also hyposensitive to other forms of stimuli. So you may have someone who is hypersensitive to sound and very reactive to noise and loud noises, but be hyposensitive to touch and maybe need more physical stimulation. Kiddos, I think about kids again, who are hyposensitive, they often do well sitting on those big exercise balls and bouncing while they're doing schoolwork, for example. So you may see that. In addition, there are eight senses and 8 sensory systems. So that produces seemingly endless combinations of what we might see in terms of having hyper and hyposensitivities in different areas. There are also 3 primary types of sensory processing differences. I'm not going to talk about those specifically, largely because I'm not an OT, and so that's not really my area of focus. I focus more on sensory processing differences as a whole. But among those 3 primary types of sensory processing differences, there are 11 subtypes, and most people display more than one subtype. If you are interested in learning more about the subtypes, you can go to this link here, and I'm happy to share slides. If you want to email me afterwards, I'm happy to share my slides with you if you want the links, but you can go there to learn more about the different subtypes of SPD. So it does create sort of this complicated picture of what sensory processing differences really are and what they look like. So across the lifespan, it's really a question I hear a lot, is questions about what does this look like across the lifespan? And in particular, do children outgrow sensory processing differences? And so to highlight sort of the range of opinions about this and the conflicting ideas about what sensory processing looks like across the lifespan, I have three different quotes. So one, in the majority of people, sensory issues resolve on their own or become significantly milder and less interfering as a child grows. So this opinion is really that people will outgrow their SPD. Another opinion, sensory dysregulation tends to get better with neurological maturation, but in many cases, it doesn't go away altogether. Most people learn coping strategies as they grow up. So we may see that it resolves on its own, but more often, the idea is that people are able to develop coping skills to manage their SPD, and so they're not as affected by it on a day-to-day basis. And then the third opinion, this comes from Mim Oxenbein. She's an occupational therapist, and she says, unfortunately, the answer, like the condition itself, is complex. We simply don't have enough evidence that children can outgrow SPD if it's left untreated. In fact, there's evidence to the contrary. research has shown a strong correlation between SPD symptoms in childhood and adulthood. So I think it's interesting to note the different professions of these people. So first you have a child and adolescent psychiatrist who basically is saying that, yes, you outgrow it. A child psychologist who's saying, we're not really sure, it may just be that you get used to having the condition. And then Mim Oxenbein, the OT, who's saying that there's really strong evidence that you don't outgrow it. And just of interest, Mim Oxenbein also has her MSW. So we really don't know if you outgrow it or if you really, if you become more adept at managing it. And certainly some people are impacted by their sensory processing differences into adulthood. So what does SPD look like in adults? There's a little bit of information that we can get from the research about what SPD looks like in adulthood. Generally, we're seeing a higher vulnerability to anxiety disorders, and this is related to the fact that high SPD symptoms in childhood seem to be correlated to high SPD symptoms in adulthood, and that leads to high emotion dysregulation that leads to anxiety. These authors refer to anxiety, somatization, and interpersonal difficulties. These authors, they studied adults with SPD who were coming into counseling and what they were noting as their most common presenting concerns. And so externalizing, internalizing behaviors, challenges with self-regulation, social and communication skills, and school-related activities. These authors also noted that individuals may experience SPD as a co-occurring disorder or as a standalone disorder, and that the psychological symptoms were actually secondary symptoms of SPD. So as people are trying to cope with the sensory challenges, it creates these psychological symptoms. Unfortunately, though, most of our studies on SPD are related to childhood, and so we don't really have a very clear picture about what SPD in adulthood looks like or how it changes and develops over the lifespan. Okay, now is going to be the opportunity, my first opportunity to have some questions before I transition into thinking about and sharing with you more about neuroscience. I just want to have an opportunity if there are any questions so far. So if you want to put those in the chat, you're welcome to.
So Elizabeth Cochran asks, can brain injuries cause SPD-like symptoms?
I don't have a definitive answer on that, but I would assume so. I would imagine so, yes, because there are certain parts of the brain that are responsible for sensory processing. And I will talk about that actually next, as well as the emotional content related to sensory processing. So I would imagine that that would be true. That would be the case, or could be. Other questions?
I don't see any other questions yet.
Okay. All right, then I will.
But wait, there's one more question here.
Oh,
it says,
okay.
is SPD similar? Paula Henry asks, is SPD similar to cognitive decline in elders for neuro disorder?
I don't know if I have an answer for that. I do know that there are sensory changes in older adulthood. And so, and again, depending on the areas of the brain where that decline may be happening, I can imagine that that would be the case. Joan Erickson, Erik Erikson's wife, actually wrote a book about sensory differences in older adulthood. I haven't read that one yet, but she did write about that. And so in terms of cognitive decline, excuse me, I don't know that I have a specific answer, yes or no, but I can, again, I would kind of imagine that that could be the case. And that particularly as certain areas of the brain are impacted, other areas of the brain around and that they're connected to, I think would certainly be impacted as well.
And Denise Guida says, or asks, a few years back, there was some work being done on sensory integration schizophrenia. Can you comment on this?
So that's not an area that I'm familiar with. I have seen in the literature some reference to that as being a comorbid disorder, but I don't know any more than that specifically. That hasn't been an area that I've examined closer. Any other questions for now?
I don't see any other questions at the moment.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'll share a little bit about the neuroscience of sensory processing. So first I'm going to talk about how our brains process sensory information and how that works. And then I'll share some more information about the neuroscience behind sensory processing differences. So sensory integration is a neurological process, and sensory processing works on a neurological level. So when the senses work well together, which we refer to as the senses being integrated, then the brain operates smoothly. And we work better when our senses are working well together as well. Balancing excitatory and inhibitory processes. So in order for us to have accurate perception of our world and for us to make useful choices in what to attend to and to act on, we need to have some of this balance, this ability to balance excitatory and inhibitory processes in the brain. So that balance is important. Action potentials are nerve impulses. So this is the actual message that's being sent through the brain. So some sensory messages are integrated at a lower brain level, which means that they're more automatic and they're not really registered. So I think about, for example, sensory messages that we may have that are working in our body around blood pressure. Most of the time, we're not aware of our blood pressure. We really would only become aware of our blood pressure if there were a problem in terms of on a sensory level. So most of those a lot of those sort of processes happen at the lower level, and we don't have any awareness of them. Just like when you're busy working on something, you're not thinking about your breathing, your brain is sort of taking care of that for you. So there are structures in the brain that are actually responsible for that communication and for that recognition that happens, and they're called basal ganglia. So these are structures of the brain that communicate between those lower level processes, those lower level areas of the brain, and the cortex, which is the outer layers of the brain. And so they choose, the basal ganglia choose what the neocortex gets for information. So sensory inputs that are sent to those outside cortical regions of the brain, those higher level parts of their brain, are then registered, and then we become aware of them. And that's what is called sensation. So sensation is our awareness of those messages that are coming through and being relayed to the cortical areas of the brain by the basal ganglia. The more stimulating a sensation, the more action. Basal ganglia can be problematic in SPD, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. So they're sort of letting more things through. Action potentials we've talked about. Sensory gating. So, action potentials, yes. So the more stimulating a sensation, the more action potentials there are. So I didn't want to miss that point. So the more stimulating something is, maybe the louder a noise is, the more action potentials there are, the more messages there are to those cortical levels of the brain, those cortical areas of the brain. And then sensory gating refers to gradual tuning out of irrelevant stimuli. So this is problematic in SPD, as I was mentioning with the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia in SPD, with individuals who have SPD, those areas of the brain are allowing too many stimuli through to a higher level. So we're therefore registering, for people who have SPD, they're registering too many stimuli to be able to maintain attention. For example, if you're hypersensitive, if you're hyposensitive, not enough messages are getting through to be able to hold your attention. So the basal ganglia are not gatekeeping properly. And so children tend to show less sensory gating than adults do. I think about this in terms of when I look at my children, that they're less able to tune out extraneous stimuli than I am. So they tend to show less sensory gating than adults. But children with SPD show even less sensory gating than their typically developing peers. So when we're working with kids who have SPD, their ability to tune that out is really compromised. So I have an example of what sensory gating looks like. On the top, you can see this is the sort of the representation of the new stimulus, new sensory information, and the reaction to it. So you see that spike. So that's that person's awareness of that sensory stimulus. In someone who is typically developing, you can see the bottom line is if that stimulus repeats itself or continues, eventually that response is not so high. It's sort of, I'm aware of it, but I'm not really paying too much attention to it. But for someone with SPD, you can see that they're very similar. That first response is pretty high, and that second response is almost as high as it was the first time the person became aware of that sensory stimuli. So the neuroscience of SPD, in people who have SPD, there's a lower activity of the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for the return to homeostasis after periods of stress. So when we experience something surprising and all of our systems come online to pay attention and to get ready for fight or flight, for example, the parasympathetic nervous system, once we are aware that we're okay, comes online and says, okay, let's bring the heart rate down. We can calm down. You can start digesting your food again, all of those things. For people with SPD, because the parasympathetic nervous system isn't functioning as well, they're not able to get back to that baseline as quickly or as easily. And so when they're maybe triggered by some of the sensory inputs, it might take them a while to kind of get back to that baseline. Children with SPD show decreased white matter in certain areas of the brain that correlate with sensory function. So white matter facilitates information transfer. So white matter is made up of axons, which carry nerve impulses to other nerve cells. And white matter is found deep inside of the brain. And this was one of the first studies. This was very exciting when this came out, because this study showed that there really were some distinct differences that made SPD distinct just by looking at the way that the brain functions. So what they found is even among differentiating children with autism spectrum disorder and children with SPD, you could see differences in how their brains were functioning. So some children, many people with autism spectrum disorder also have sensory processing differences, but some children who just have the sensory processing difference, who are otherwise typically developing, this study showed that their brains really were developing differently and showed different degrees of connection efficiency, so in their brains. And then the limbic system is also responsible for some of this role in sensory processing. So the limbic system, which is also referred to as the seat of attachment. I think that's important and relevant for us to think about. It receives sensory input that helps to regulate emotion, and it integrates meaning and social experience. So I think about hugging, for example. If you have a kiddo who is hypersensitive and they get a hug that feels too tight, their limbic system may sort of attribute a feeling of that hug being rough or scary to that experience. If you have a kiddo who's hyposensitive and the hug doesn't feel like enough, then the limbic system is going to sort of color that experience as feeling insufficient or not containing. Versus if you get a hug that feels just right for you, then that feels comforting. So the limbic system is sort of involved in that emotional content as well. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk a little bit more about the role of social workers and thinking about how often we're bumping into this and what we need to do to be supportive and the ways that we can think about sensory processing in the populations that we work with. So estimates are that somewhere between 5 to 16% of the US population experiences sensory processing differences. So it feels like a pretty wide range, but the bottom line is really that there are a large number of people who are walking around with sensory processing differences. Just among children, that means up to 12 million children in the United States alone are walking around experiencing this. SPD can be associated with autism spectrum disorder, but I want to highlight the fact that they're not mutually assured. So there is a misconception that SPD is a feature of ASD and can't be independent of that diagnosis. But there are many people who don't have ASD, who are not on the spectrum, who also have, who do have sensory processing differences. SPD can affect a child's adaptive behavior, their learning, their movement, their play, and their academic performance. And so these are really areas where we as social workers are certainly bound to get involved and see some of these things and hopefully be able to be helpful. So SPD has an impact on lots of different areas of people's everyday lives. And these are a few. I'm going to highlight just a few of these. So again, concentration I've mentioned before, but you can, again, you can imagine that if you are being bombarded with sensory information, or if you're not getting enough sensory information, it would be very hard to concentrate and to focus on sort of the day-to-day things that are going on around you and be able to maintain that focus. Similarly, organization can be challenging if you are kind of being derailed all the time by what's happening with your senses. Self-control and self-esteem in particular, I want to highlight because I think about for kiddos who are engaging in school or trying to play with friends, it can be very hard to imagine, to understand why it's so hard for you and why it's so easy for other kids. I used to know, she's now grown up, but a little girl who just would compare herself to her sister and say, you know, my sister has it so easy. She doesn't, why is it so easy for her and it's so hard for me? Academic learning, it seems pretty understandable as well. And then relationships, you know, if you are the kiddo, again, who's sort of bumping into somebody or doesn't have good boundaries, then people may not be as interested in playing with you. Similarly, if you are the kiddo who is avoiding things because your senses are so overwhelmed, then you're not getting the opportunity to have some of those same relationships and involve yourself in some of the same activities. And certainly, again, through play, that's going to have an impact on being able, how you're able to play. So all of this sort of boils down to what are we looking at? And that can be really challenging when we meet with someone to know exactly what's going on with them when we start considering all of the different ways that sensory processing differences can present, and particularly thinking about the fact that there are a lot of things that SPD looks like and has these symptom overlaps with. And SPD is really not very well recognized by our profession, by counseling professions. And there are a number of symptoms associated with SPD that are common in the diagnoses that we often assign to clients. So symptoms that stem from coping with SPD include anxiety, aggression, poor self-esteem, and relational concerns. So we may see some of these things again as secondary symptoms to figuring out how to manage and live with SPD. ADHD is a common one. I always joke with students that anything looks like ADHD, everything looks like ADHD. And so sensory processing differences certainly can look like ADHD. If you look at the ADHD criteria, there are two in particular that cause some problems for trying to figure out if it's really ADHD or if it's sensory processing differences. So one is that the child doesn't seem to listen when spoken to. So It may be ADHD, but in reality, that behavior might be the result of a child's hyposensitivity, that they're not able to register the verbal stimulus. And so it's as though it's tuned out. And the other criteria that stands out is the child is easily distracted by extraneous stimuli. Well, that's obviously a hallmark of SPD as well. And then a few other diagnoses that SPD can kind of mimic or look like. Trauma, I always talk about how trauma and ADHD can look very similar, and similarly, and in the same vein, SPD can also look like trauma. Trauma can look like SPD. So the bottom line for me is that we really have to return to the idea of our biopsychosocial roots. I joke that social workers tend to be good at the psycho and the social, but we're sort of iffy sometimes on the bio part. So we have to really be thinking about that bio piece. And that's why I think having an understanding of what's going on in those kids or those individuals' brains from the neurobiology piece is helpful. So in terms of comorbid diagnoses, there are, again, a few that we see in the research that are showing up at the same time as we're also seeing SPD. Autism is certainly one of them. Approximately 3/4 of children who are on the spectrum also have SPD, but again, not all children with SPD are on the spectrum. There is a correlation between SPD and ADHD, as well as anxiety and learning disorders and selective mutism. I have this note here about maybe speech and language, OCD, Fragile X, and dyslexia, because these are things that I've seen sort of floating around on the internet, but I haven't necessarily seen them tied specifically in the peer-reviewed literature. But those things may also sort of be comorbid with SPD. Okay, so how can social workers help? What can we offer in terms of this picture? So one, certainly being aware of those symptom overlaps and paying attention to triggers and antecedents to behaviors that may actually be SPD. It's important, obviously, to know what we're really looking at, because accurate treatment is going to rely on accurate assessment and diagnosis. I think about engaging early with families who have young children. SPD isn't typically recognized, often not until kids end up in school, and then they start having more problems because schools are busy, they're overwhelming. They're suddenly faced with a lot of demands at school, and so SPD sometimes isn't recognized until kids end up in school. So I think a lot, and my research has focused on sensory processing and attachment, and if there's a relationship there, and there are a few studies that do have found a correlation between sensory processing differences and not insecure attachment so much, but just challenges to the attachment relationship. And so if we can be supportive of families that have young children and have this in the back of our minds when we hear from caregivers that they have a concern about their child, which leads me to my next point, which is one of the things that we can do is trusting caregivers, parents, when they say that something feels different about their child. A number of the caregivers that I spoke with in my research talked about how they felt really dismissed by providers, that they really didn't get support, and that their concerns were sort of just dismissed and not really taken seriously. So that can be one thing that we can do. I also think it's important for us to be aware of the environments that we're working in, and the ways that those environments can be challenging to people with sensory processing differences. So thinking about where exactly are we, and are we having sessions in schools where things feel really busy and overwhelming? Are we working in hospitals that are similarly busy and overwhelming? Can we create environments that work for people with sensory processing differences? And then The next, what I think is sort of an obvious one, is connecting with OTs. So OTs are really natural partners for social workers. Their profession was originally rooted in mental health. And so they have a, excuse me, a pretty good understanding of what we do. And so we can speak, and we speak a lot of the same language. So in terms of making referrals, you can look for OTs who specialize in sensory integration. Very often they highlight this on their websites if you go to their websites. And if you're working with kids, looking for providers, OTs who are trained in the SIPT, that sensory integration praxis test that they use to assess for sensory processing differences. And then in collaboration with OTs, thinking about consistent strategies across treatments, again, because they kind of speak a similar language to social work language, we can really connect and think about the ways that we can be supportive of what's happening in OT sessions, in our sessions with clients, and particularly thinking about how can we maybe translate some of the regulation, the self-regulation work that they might be getting, physically regulating in an OT session, and how can we help them with sort of the more emotional regulation component that might come along with sensory processing differences. So from my perspective, social work is definitely valuable for people with sensory processing differences. We offer them an opportunity to practice regulation strategies and build coping strategies. Clients may have a lot of different feelings about their differences, their sensory processing differences, and how it impacts their daily lives. So they may feel fear, they may feel anxiety, they may feel grief, they may feel shame. And so we can certainly help them work through all of those responses and reactions as well. And clients may not fully understand SPD, so we can also work with them on psychoeducation and normalizing the prevalence of SPD, that really there are a lot of people who have these sensory processing differences, but we just aren't really talking about it or thinking about it that much. We aren't recognizing it. Addressing comorbid concerns that we talked about before, and evaluating behavioral and emotional responses, family dynamics, resources, and needs. The family dynamics piece I think about in terms of just how does a person's sensory processing differences and their very unique needs around their sensation, how does that impact, family relationships? And I think too about thinking about, in terms of those other resources, finding activities and outlets that might be useful for people with sensory processing differences. So thinking about, can we turn this into a way for people to think of it as something that makes them unique, and finding talent and skill in SPD. So I think about, for a kiddo maybe who needs more sensory input to be focused and regulated, would something like gymnastics be great for them? That joint pressure, or karate or whatever. Can we find activities where their sensory processing differences might actually not only feel better, but maybe even be an asset? I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we can also advocate for people with sensory processing disorder, and in particular, thinking about populations that are less advantaged. So for populations who don't have as much privilege or advantage, there are significant risks that SPD will slip through the cracks or be misdiagnosed. And one of the ways that this may present is through lack of parity in treatment and resources. So not all states cover occupational therapy under Medicaid, and private OT practices often don't accept Medicaid, even if it would be covered. So for people with sensory processing differences, if they have coverage through Medicaid, often they have to be seen for treatment at hospitals, and hospitals are busy and noisy and overwhelming, and they may not be the most conducive place for working on sensory processing challenges. When Medicaid does cover treatment for SPD, there's also a gap between those with Medicaid and those who can afford to pay out of pocket. So we have people who are getting services potentially through Medicaid, and then you have people who can afford to pay for OT out of pocket, which can be pretty expensive. But then you have this gap in the middle of people who aren't getting either, aren't getting access either way. And so thinking about that as well. So that's that insurance reimbursement piece. Misdiagnosis, I think, is a concern for anyone that we may be seeing with sensory processing differences. But in particular, I want us to think a little bit about for individuals of color and for children of color, they're more likely to be diagnosed, we know from studies that they're more likely to be diagnosed with behavioral disorders, so things like disruptive behavior or conduct disorder. So those labels are not only wrong, and therefore they're not getting great treatment because they're not being treated for what they're really coming in with, but they're also incredibly labeling and stigmatizing. And then thinking about other resources as well. So access to those extracurricular activities, like I was talking about the gymnastics class, and also other things, access to other things, even just like time or internet research, time to do that, access to the internet. A number of the providers or the caregivers, I'm sorry, that I spoke with in my research talked about how they did a lot of internet deep dives into the internet to try to figure out what was going on with their child. And when they had been dismissed by the pediatrician or by social workers, perhaps, or by other providers, and no one was really listening to them, they spent a lot of time reading books and following up and looking at symptom checklists online. And so some of our clients may not have the time or the resources to be able to do that. So lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about some other areas of advocacy, larger advocacy as well as smaller advocacy. So thinking about Medicaid and the importance of Medicaid for coverage and thinking about that under the Affordable Care Act. So the Affordable Care Act, we know, has had some corrective impact on issues of social and economic justice, and in particular has had an impact on reduction of health coverage disparities among different racial and ethnic groups. And so being able to support Medicaid expansion is important. In Massachusetts, we already have Medicaid expansion. But there are still 12 states that do not have, they haven't expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Most of those states are in the South, and if Medicaid were to expand in those states, more than 3 million people would gain health coverage. And so while we may not be in that position in Massachusetts, we can still use our social work advocacy skills to think about those people who are in other states. One nice bit of good news is that starting in April of this year, the American Rescue Plan expanded ACA premium subsidies to higher income people who didn't previously qualify. So that meant that some of the people who may have been paying out of pocket were now able to get some relief, as well as on the other end, some of the people who are not getting services at all because they didn't have Medicaid and couldn't afford to pay out of pocket, they may now have coverage. So that's some good news. School social work policies I want to talk about for just a minute. So many children's sensory processing differences are more pronounced at school. I mentioned before that schools are very busy places. And again, there are a lot of expectations on kids at school. So the availability of school-based OT is really useful and helpful for kids with sensory processing differences. And if we can advocate for expansion of OT services in schools to serve kids with SPD, then that's helpful. A lot of times kids with SPD are not getting access to those services because either they're holding it together during the school day and then they're kind of melting down at home, which is really hard, or they're not eligible because it's not impacting their academics as much. It's maybe impacting other areas. And so if we can think about how to get access for kids to OT in schools, that's really helpful. We can also assist school administrators and teachers in understanding sensory processing differences and what they're looking at. So for example, this might not be ADHD, this might be a sensory processing difference, just as we sort of help them to understand the difference between ADHD and trauma. And then also helping school administrators and teachers understand how SPD may impact relationships. So how they may be impacted in the classroom, how it can be challenging, frustrating to have a kiddo who has sensory processing differences in the classroom and trying to meet those needs while also teaching and all of the other needs of children. So helping them maybe understand SPD better might help them also have greater compassion for those kids. And also how SPD may be impacting the relationship with peers as well, so that those kids may need some extra social support as well. And then finally, thinking about social work training regarding SPD and how it relates to social functioning. So I'm hoping that today's presentation contributes somewhat to that end. And before I take some more questions, I will wish you all a happy Sensory Awareness Month. So any questions for me?
Susan Becher says, do high rates of technology use by children and adults impact rates of SPD?
I don't know that it impacts the rates of SPD. SPD is typically thought to be something that is inherent at birth. It may have a genetic component to it as well. But I do think we may see more of the sensory processing differences if kids are using technology a lot, because it may be feeding into some of the sensory processing differences. So I think it may highlight the sensory processing differences more than it necessarily creates that.
There's another question. Are developmental delays usually common in kids with SPD?
So I think there is some relationship between developmental delays, and certainly autism is sort of the one that you hear the most about in relation to SPD. So I would say there's commonly a correlation. I don't know that it's necessarily a chicken or an egg situation where one is sort of coming before the other necessarily, but very often we do see developmental delays and SPD together.
And then the next question I see is, forgive me, I'm not in the industry, is ARFID a feature of a type of SPD, or would it be more likely a comorbidity?
I don't really know the answer to that. I suspect it's more likely a comorbidity, but I don't know for sure.
Okay, next question. If this disorder is not in the DSM, but we suspect a child is having these issues, who can actually give the child diagnosis, such as an OT?
So OTs are really the ones that identify and assess and provide treatment for sensory processing differences. You're right, it's not in the DSM. I don't know what the chances are of it eventually getting in as its own distinct disorder are. I know that I'm sure that the sensory processing sort of groups are working on that and making a case for it. And there is a lot more research on SPD coming out. Part of the reason that I refer to SPD as sensory processing differences comes from my communication with the OTs, that they were uncomfortable with me using the language about diagnosing because it's not a diagnosis. So I refer to labeling or identifying a child with SPD But yes, OTs are really the ones that are best suited to do that.
The next question is, any tips or resources for regulation strategies?
So I can think of a few that I will share, but I definitely, in terms of thinking about a specific client that you're working with, if you are able to talk with or partner with, collaborate with an OT, I think that that's especially helpful. And again, my brain just sort of automatically goes to thinking about children. But I think depending on the nature of the sensory processing disorder, if it's hypersensitivity, hyposensitivity, which senses are we talking about? Sensory systems are we talking about? I know some things that are very regulating for kids that are sensory. So things that are tactile tend to be very regulating, very calming for kids. Play-Doh, fidgety things, those Mardi Gras beads I used to have in my office when I was in practice. I would have a length of them. I wouldn't have them as a loop, but I would have I would cut them, and having them being able to sort of play and fidget with those can be helpful. For kids who are in school and have to sit at a desk, those, if anybody's been to PT, they have those TheraBands, and they're stretchy, and you can tie those to the legs of the chair, and the kid can bounce their legs back and forth against that, and that can be helpful in regulating. If you are in a school that has the resources to do it, having those exercise balls for some kids is really helpful. It really sort of depends. When I worked with kids, I would have some kids, I would bring shaving cream sometimes to play with. And I would have some kids who were all over the place and really messy with it and really getting involved in it, which gives me some information about their sensory processing. And I would have other kids who would ask if they could use a paintbrush because they didn't want to touch it. So it really sort of does depend on the kid or the client that you're working with. But I would say trying things out, making those stress balls with balloons and salt, that can be helpful in regulating. I used to have rules for the kids if they brought them back to the classroom that they had to share with their teacher. So one, the stress ball is just for me. I'm not permitted to share it. We don't throw the stress ball because if salt went all over the place. And if the stress ball breaks, I'm responsible for cleaning it up. But just helpful things like that. But really, yeah, I think talking with OTs is really helpful in terms of getting ideas about that, and it's particularly about any individual client and their unique sensory presentation.
All right, and then Danielle Cleary asks, how can schools help kids with SPD on a daily basis? And are kids with SPD supported with an IEP?
So I'll answer the second question first. Kids with SPD may be supported on an IEP depending on what else is presenting. Oftentimes kids who have SPD are not on IEPs, again, because either the SPD is not interfering with their academic performance. Sometimes, again, those kids may be holding it together all day long and then melting down when they get home. But they may, a lot of times though, even if they are in an IEP, they may not be getting OT for the SPD because that's not what they're on the IEP for. So that part's really kind of tricky and unfortunate for kids with SPD. In terms of what can schools do, I mean, lots of things, although I'm hesitant to name too many because how far can we expect schools to stretch? Schools are asked to do a lot of different things for kids, but I think having an awareness of the environment, that having an awareness of the fact that this might be a really overwhelming place for kids with SPD, who are particularly kids who are hypersensitive. movement breaks are, I think, huge. So offering, I mean, I think movement breaks are huge for all kids, but movement breaks, particularly for kids with SPD. Another thing that's going back to what's regulating, another thing that's regulating is left brain, right brain stimulation. So if you can get kids up and walking, when you move, when you're walking, you have this bilateral movement where one leg goes forward and the opposite arm comes forward. So you're using both sides of the brain in doing that. And so that bilateral stimulation can be regulating. So that's part of the reason that movement is helpful. When I used to see kids in schools, I would play, when we walked back to the classroom, we would do a regulation game. We would play red light, green light on the way back to the classroom, walking, of course, but they would walk really quickly. And then I would say red light and they would have to stop, or yellow light, they would have to sort of move slower. So some of those things, and that's also integrating left brain and right brain, that activity of going from full speed to stop, or just slowing down, is practicing regulation. So.
All right, Kelly Quinn asks, what are the best resources for elementary age students playing SPD? Is this a website bank of resources that is a good starting spot?
So there are a few. The STAR Institute has a lot of resources. They also have a lot of great resources for providers who are looking to learn more. And if you want to share information with others, for example, if you're working in a school and you want to share with the teachers, the STAR Institute, they offer some interesting, they now have little bios about kids who have sensory processing differences. And they're sort of nice stories that you can have a discussion with other people about. So I would start with them. The Spiral Foundation, they do research related to sensory processing differences. So they're a good resource if you want to see sort of what's current and going on in research around SPD. I can think of others. And if you would like, you can email me. My next slide is my contact information. So if you want to email me, I can probably come up with a more cultivated list of websites that I think are helpful and share those.
Great, we've got a few more questions here. Donna Kennedy asks, does early vestibular stimulation help to improve neural pathways?
Ooh, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know that I'm necessarily qualified to answer that, but that vestibular sense and that stimulation, I don't know. I would ask an OT that question, but that's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that way before.
Dan Larson asks, do you have any thoughts on whether parents of a child with hypo-sensitivity should increase sensory stimuli to meet the child's need, or is that a concern / problematic?
I think partly it depends on the age. I think the younger a child is, the more we have to meet them where they are and not expect them to conform to our environment. Again, because I study attachment and have studied attachment for kids with sensory processing differences, those caregivers that I interviewed talked about doing a lot of work to accommodate their child's sensory processing needs. And what was interesting about that is that a lot of them were doing it before the SPD was even identified. So kids often aren't identified until they go to school, but in terms of meeting like attachment needs, it was happening really early. So I think the younger a child is, the more it's important to try to meet those needs and give them more of that stimulation. One, because I think it helps with the relationship, and two, because it helps those kids connect and feel that they are connected to their world and connected to their environment. I think at a certain point, yes, unfortunately, I hesitate to say this, but the way that the world is set up right now and the way that we're structured right now in terms of supports and services for SPD, I think there is a need for kids to eventually start understanding that the world doesn't cater to their sensory processing needs and learn about regulation and managing it. So regardless of what we think about how SPD changes across the lifespan, I think supporting those regulation strategies is going to be really important, and learning those coping strategies is going to be really important, because they're probably going to have to figure out how to get themselves kind of online in order to attend and focus. But it feels like a lot to put on a kid, but yeah.
And Denise Guida says, I have always been fortunate to work on teams with OT services and at times expressive arts therapists who can be licensed and billable. I know there is a crossover in both these fields. Do you find EA therapists more available and or helpful?
I love expressive arts therapists. I just love them. In my past, I've done play therapy, which I think is also really useful for kids with sensory processing differences. But yes, I'm struggling to find other words besides yes, absolutely. I think anytime we can offer kids a different way of communicating what they need, or just communicating in general, the better. There are so many demands that are put on kids to conform to an adult, typically developing environment, that the more ways we can engage with them on their terms, the better. So lucky you to have had those good connections.
Donna Kennedy asks, does early vestibular stimulation, wait, did
Yeah, we talked about that one.
That sounds familiar. All right.
I'm going to be Googling that later.
Angela Collier asks, in your research and work with children with SPD, have you seen correlations between in utero exposure to substances and prevalence of SPD in early childhood or adolescence?
So we don't have a great answer for this, but the general thinking is that experiences in utero certainly more than likely have a relationship with sensory processing differences.
Steph asks, what approaches have you used in helping clients, youth and adults, raise interoceptive awareness?
So that interoceptive, again, is just sort of awareness of what's going on in your body. So like hunger, fatigue, I think about this too a lot in terms of anxiety, and there is a lot of overlap in terms of symptom crossover and comorbidity with anxiety and SPD. So I think a lot of the things that you would do with an anxious client, you can do with a client with sensory processing differences. So I think about all of the activities that you can do with kids in particular, those human figure outline drawings where you color in where in your body, closing your eyes, thinking about something that's made you feel sad. Where in your body do you feel sadness? Where in your body do you feel anger? Doing some of those activities. I think for kids and clients who are old enough, for adults, certainly doing some journaling can be really helpful about, okay, this is, either taking time out at a certain time every single day to just sort of notice what's going on in your body and making a note of it and comment, just jotting it down. This is what I'm noticing. Or if they're able to recognize something feels different, something feels off, I don't feel right, I don't feel comfortable, if they can sit and journal for a minute or two about what they're noticing in their body, I think that starts to make it a little bit more conscious, that, oh, I can start to cue into these things. A lot of times we get the message, all of us, not just people with sensory processing disorder or differences, but I think a lot of times we get the message that what our body's telling us isn't important. And I think we as social workers know that that's absolutely just not true. But our clients get that message that, you know, what's going on in your body isn't important. What you're doing is important. Keep focusing on what you're doing. And so if we can help people to think more about what's going on in their bodies and paying attention to it and listening to it, then I think that helps with also the emotion regulation as well. Any other questions?
That's all I see at the moment for questions. Janet B just had a brief comment that said self-efficacy. It was probably in regards to something you were talking about earlier. And that's all that I have right now. So it's 7:24. We can hang out for a little bit longer if anyone else has any other questions.
So this is my contact information. You're welcome to get in touch with me if you want to talk more about this topic. I'm always interested to hear what people are seeing and experiencing in the field.
Great. And I just wanted to briefly say, look, I'm going to put my email in the chat here again, because I will be sending out emails to those who attended today with you a survey and the password to get into the survey. And that once you complete the survey, your CEU will be processed and sent to you electronically. So if for any reason you're having any issues, or you don't get the email or anything, need any help with it, you can always email me and I'll help you out. So my email is jholland@salemstate.edu.
And thank you all for putting up with my technical difficulties and then the fire alarm going off. So I appreciate that. And I do have some references here as well. But there's a lot more.
I don't know if you're seeing the comments, Catherine, but everyone's saying thank you. Great job.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for being interested in it, honestly. I hope that you find it helpful in your practice, and I hope you spread the word about sensory processing differences, and that we're bumping into them whether we know it or not.
There's a question, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint with the references?
Yes, if you email me, so I'll go back to my email slide.